Say something, boils and ghouls.
Children of the night, what music they make. Hello everyone and welcome to day 8 of Terrorthon, the golden age of horror. We spend a lot of time on Terrorthon talking about horror movies, but we've never really examined the history of them as an art form, so we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, from the 1900s to the 1940s, which is now commonly known as the golden age of horror. What is possibly the very first horror movie, certainly one of the first movies ever, was Frankenstein in 1910. Now, when you compare this to the classic Frankenstein's monster image that we have today, the monster looks very unusual in this. In fact, it would be a stretch to even call this a horror movie, really. The entire thing is free on YouTube if you're so inclined. And then from Germany came The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, which Roger Ebert, the famous movie reviewer, describes as the first proper horror movie. Very surreal, and as I said last year, Tim Burton would not have had a career without this movie. Then 2 years later, also from Germany, barely surviving total destruction due to a rights issue, came the silent movie tour de force of horror, Nosferatu. You may not be familiar with the movie, but it is still referenced to this day, which is testament to its power. Then in 1925 came Lon Chaney's version of The Phantom of the Opera. It is said that when this movie first premiered, women and the nervous peoples were throwing up in their hats and fainting in the theatre at the unmasking scene, which you're looking at now. And then we get to the really famous ones, the Universal monsters. All of these guys were owned by Universal Studios, hence the name, and they absolutely dominated the horror scene all the way through the 30s and 40s, starting with Dracula and Frankenstein, both released in 1931 and paving the way for horror to come. Then in 1932 we had The Mummy, which has had countless remakes since then, but we'll get to that. And lest we forget The Invisible Man in 1933, based on the famous H.G. Wells story. It was a classic movie and the special effects for 1933 were mind-blowing. Still pretty good by modern standards, to be fair. And then Universal tried a different tact for horror movies. They decided to adapt the works of famous author Edgar Allan Poe. So they did Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1932, The Black Cat in 1934, and then finally The Raven in 1935. All of these are considered classics by modern standards. And then the final Universal monster of the Golden Age was born in 1941, The Wolf Man. It just goes to show how long ago we're talking here that the movie wasn't called, say, The Werewolf or something like that. Every single one of the Universal monsters we've just discussed, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man and The Wolf Man, they all had multiple sequels. A lot of them rehashed the original movies, but they were there. And then we had the first ever movie monster crossover, and probably the first movie crossover in history, with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman in 1943. From this point on, the comedians Abbott and Costello began to make movies with the Universal monsters, and that essentially signalled the end of the golden age of horror. However you may feel about these movies, the fact that these are all horror icons even to this day speaks volumes about how impressive they were for the time. We're now getting remakes like The Mummy, The Invisible Man. Universal are bringing them all back, so maybe it's time for the second golden age of horror. See you tomorrow.